In March of 2024, Caleb Montgomery lived a relatively simple life in New Mexico. But he didn't just live in New Mexico, he lived in a small town of Edgewood. If you've never been to Edgewood, you're not missing much. It's a hole-in-the-wall town, out in the middle of nowhere, which makes this experience fit the setting better. At around 10 p.m., Caleb, who was over at his friend's house, decided to go outside to his car and grab his Xbox. The second he stepped outside, he was already feeling slightly off. He couldn't quite place what it was, but there was just this lingering sensation and feeling in the air. He would describe it as if someone was watching him. He begins to go over to his vehicle, trying to ignore his intuition, and at this point, his vehicle is a considerable distance from the house. So he has to walk a little in the dark to get to it. And so the entire time he's just looking down at his feet, trying his best to navigate. Suddenly, he just gets this sinking feeling that something is really wrong and he needs to check his surroundings ASAP. So he stops what he's doing, he looks up, and immediately, off in the distance, sees these glowing red orbs floating there. Remember that this night, it's very dark with cloud coverage. There is no moon, so there can't be anything reflecting a light source. As he sees these strange eyes, he notices they are attached to this large shadow. Then he begins to feel the ground vibrating and notices that whatever this is begins moving closer to him. Immediately, panic overtook him and he began to bolt back to the house as fast as he could. If you or I were in that situation, your one goal would be to get back as fast as you can to the front door and slam it shut. Whatever this dark shadow was getting closer and closer. As he's approaching the house, there's this kind of rock wall that leads right down to the bottom part of the house, and he practically trips his way down and smacks his head and arm. Now at this point, he looks up and he could see this thing approaching him. It's still very dark, so he's having a hard time making out specific details, but he can see enough that he is incredibly intimidated and terrified. He can pull himself up from the stupor and rush back inside. Now, as he gets back inside, his friend's looking at him and he's like, "Why are you so freaked out?" And, he's a little scuffed, but overall he's okay. But he just does his best to try and write it off like anyone else, and, that he saw a large coyote and he got spooked. And so he and his friend could pretty much just laugh it off like it was nothing. And so he decided to go out and crash. Now, fast forward to the following day, and he goes back outside to grab his Xbox. And this is actually the following night, really early in the morning, about 3 a.m. And this time, unlike the previous night when it was really dark, there's a full moon, so there is illumination. Like the prior night, Caleb makes his way out to his car to grab his Xbox, and he begins to get this sensation again. It was very strange, and so he looks around, he sees nothing at first, and simply ignores it. Now, remember that his gut is just knotted up this entire time. He's expecting something to happen, but still doesn't see anything. So he gets close to his vehicle. Immediately, his intuition begins screaming at him to look off to his left, and so he looks over, and he could see this significant-sized shadow looming there. Instantly, he recognizes this as the thing he saw the night before, but unlike last night when it was moving towards him, this time it was just standing there, as if it was waiting for something. Again, he did the same thing the night prior. He just took off running, scared for his life. Now, even though he runs back inside the house, he still keeps it on the down low and doesn't really tell anybody anything. As you can imagine, if you said this to your friends, they would either think you're trolling them or lying flat out. Well, this wouldn't be the last time Caleb saw this. Fast forward a little while later, and Caleb would take a trip to Wyoming. The trip was relatively benign, and he enjoyed himself for the most part. Now, this is the part of the story that makes me believe that this was supernatural, or at least paranormal in nature due to what happens next. Caleb never specified precisely what time of the evening this next event occurred or how long after he had visited Wyoming. However, he went out to his vehicle at some point with what I can only assume to be nighttime. After making it out, he begins to smell this horrific, ungodly odor. Caleb described it as a mix of wet dog and rotting flesh. Now, Caleb cannot identify where the smell is coming from or what could be making it. He's looking around for any trace of this odor but can't find anything. Then, Caleb begins to realize that this odor is not coming from his car but from behind him. And once again, that wrenching sensation overcomes him and he just feels something terrible will happen. Now, keep in mind that he's all the way out in Wyoming at this point, which, if you're not too familiar with your geography, is quite a ways away from New Mexico. So Caleb immediately turns around as his intuition guides him, and he sees this thing standing there, the same horrific black mass that he's seen the past 2 times. And what's even worse is it is incredibly close to him. It begins to reach out its arms to try and grab hold of him. So without even shutting his car door, his body reacts out of fear. He just takes off running and doesn't take a moment to look back. However, as he's running for his life, he could hear this thing following him. It wasn't chasing him like running after him, but it was pursuing him. And he could hear the steps of this thing moving closer and closer to him. Now, there is one detail about this story that I still need to mention. Caleb did not find this out till afterward, but the neighbor who lived right next to his friend's house, the one whom he saw twice, apparently had his dog murdered by this thing. Caleb had the opportunity to speak to this neighbor. The neighbor explained that he could see the same red eyes that Caleb did. Because many of us love dogs and pets, I'm not going to go into all the gross details of how, what, who, and why, but you guys can fill in the blanks. Disturbingly, Caleb reached out to me and described that this thing was at least 8 feet tall and standing upright on its 2 back feet. He has no idea what it was or what it could have been, but it has horrified him since, and he still has issues with it today. Unfortunately, I regret to inform all of you that the friend's house where he was staying at in the first part of the story committed suicide about a month ago. Rest in peace. As far as the hideous black apparition creature stalking Caleb, its identity remains unknown. In 2008, Hank Wilmington lived a relatively modest life with his wife and 2-year-old daughter. However, during this time frame, his daughter would begin to see unsuspecting visitors, or judging by the title, unwanted visitors. At the time, Hank and his family lived beside an American Legion building. Because of how their house was, his 2-year-old daughter's window faced that building. Now, again, they lived a relatively everyday life, so what happened completely took Hank off guard. One day, when Hank talked to his daughter, she explained that she would see 3 people over in the other building. It was a mom, a boy, and a girl, and she explained that they had green skin and red eyes. It was bizarre. Hank thought this was odd coming from a 2-year-old, so he just tried to press her for more information. He asked her if he thought they lived there, and she explained that yes, sometimes they come over. Obviously, since this is coming from a 2-year-old, Hank and his wife, and I'm sure many of you would probably just take this with a grain of salt. After all, it's probably just her imagination, and we all know how kids like to imagine. But folks, things get strange very quickly. Now that we have context for the story, Hank and his family start to experience some creepy stuff. There was one time shortly after this when Hank and his wife were just in the kitchen, and all of a sudden, Hank saw that she was shoved visibly by something. He and his wife could hear an audible voice saying, "What are you doing, Mommy?" The voice was that of a child, and remember that their own 2-year-old would not have the physical strength to push her mother like this, and she wasn't even in the same room. So they're looking at each other. They have no idea how to explain what has just happened. They were spooked by it. But what can you do in that situation, folks? You just have to move on, toss it over your shoulder as something weird that's happened. Unfortunately, it didn't end there. At the time, Hank worked the second shift and often slept in the living room. And just like any other time he gets home, he's getting ready for bed and begins to lie down, and everything is relatively normal. And you know how you're lying there and, you're right between being conscious and trying to shut your brain down, but your body is starting to relax? Well, he's at that stage and thought that he could feel their 2-year-old daughter come and lay beside him. Thinking it was her, he turns over and is shocked when he sees an indentation of a small child beside him. Now he's looking and he's kind of double taking to try and grasp what reality has now been shattered for him. And he looks and sees his 2-year-old daughter snuggling away and sound asleep with his then wife. Apparently, this was not a one-time thing either. Hank would often describe these strange tingling sensations moving up his hands and feet, and sometimes it was almost like a crawling sensation. Other times it would be a jolting sensation as if something had jumped on the bed. It's all very strange. Now, around this time, Hank also had a son who was nonverbal and autistic. Hank and his family experienced a lot of trouble, and so at one point or another, he ended up divorcing his wife and would remarry sometime after. Unfortunately, even though he remarried to a different woman, they experienced a lot of the same things. Strange sensations and the feeling of a presence that could be felt but could never really be seen. However, even that was only sometimes true. There were times when Hank explained that he would briefly see the appearance of a small girl in his hallway. He would describe her as having a white gown on, but there were no discernible legs or even arms for that matter. All he was able to see was black hair, pale white skin, and large black holes for eyes. I don't know about you guys, but if that doesn't scream creepy, I don't know what does. During this time, his wife had a 2-year-old niece who would sometimes come to stay and visit. And it was during one of these visits that Hank and his wife woke up to her sitting at the edge of the bed, having a conversation with nobody. Well, there was somebody, but they just couldn't see it. And so they asked her who she's talking to. And she just told them, like matter-of-factly, that there was a little girl that lived there and her name is Skippy. In fact, even Hank's daughter at the time would tell her father about playing with the ghost in her own room, and apparently the ghost resided in her closet. Now again, Hank would continue to experience marital issues and would divorce and remarry yet again. If you thought his ghostly problems would end there, they didn't. In fact, his third wife would actually be touched by this entity. And in fact, judging by what Hank explained, it seems more lively than ever. It would mess with electronics and turn on the TV in their house when they're home, and activity is still continuing to this very day. Interestingly, Hank reported that even though this strange ghostly appearance follows him around no matter where he goes in life, it doesn't seem intent on causing him any harm or pain or fear. So for the time being, he just lives with it. Strangely, the identity of the green skin family that was next door all those years ago and who or what Skippy really is, the ghost girl, remains a mystery. Many years ago, Daniel was raised in the foster system. He'd been in the system since the day he was born, bouncing from home to home, never quite settling in one place for too long. But despite the constant upheaval, Daniel had seen the best of all worlds in those homes. Some were lenient, but one foster parent stood out from the rest. A praying warrior who taught Daniel the power of faith. Daniel didn't understand it at the time, just being a little kid, but as he grew older and more mature, he realized the significance of what his foster parent had been trying to teach him. Daniel had always felt like something was attached to him, supernatural and demonic. It was like this entity had chosen him, had assigned itself to him, and reminded Daniel of its presence occasionally. It started with small things, a flicker of the lights, a cold spot in the room, a shadow in the corner of his eye. However, as Daniel grew older, the occurrences became more frequent and noticeable. And yet, despite the growing tension, Daniel wasn't afraid. He had gotten too close to God. You see, in his maturity, he realized that These demons, these spirits, they couldn't do anything to him unless God allowed it. God would not put more on him than he could handle. But there was one terrifying incident that would forever change Daniel's perspective. It happened when he was around 12 years old. He was going about his day minding his own business when suddenly, without warning, he was possessed by a demon. That's the thing about demons. They don't discriminate. They'll take any opportunity, any opening to worm their way in and take control. And that, folks, is exactly what happened. One moment he was himself, and the next he was on autopilot, watching helplessly as his body moved and spoke without his consent. He could see everything he was doing, but he had no control over it. It was like a passenger in his own skin, and the driver was hell-bent on destruction. The demon's thoughts flooded Daniel's mind: hatred, anger, a desire to hurt and destroy, and its target, Daniel's foster mother, who was a woman who had shown him nothing but love and kindness and faith. The demon wanted to make her hurt, to make her suffer, and it was using Daniel's body to do it. But Daniel's foster mother was a woman of faith, and she knew exactly what to do. She started praying, calling out the name of Jesus over and over again, and with each utterance of that holy name, Daniel could feel the demon's anger growing, its grip on him weakening. He tried to tune her out to block out the sound of Jesus' name, but it was like this beacon of light in the darkness, drawing him back to himself. As his foster mother continued to pray, Daniel felt a strength rising up in him, a power that he had never known before. He began to fight back against this demon, struggling to regain control. It was a battle of wills, a tug of war between good and evil, and for a moment, it seemed like the demon would win. But something miraculous happened. Daniel started to say Jesus' name, and it was like a key turning in a lock, a door swinging open to let in the light. With each repetition of that name, this thing's hold on him weakened until finally, with one last desperate cry, it fled from his body, leaving him shaken but free. From that day forward, Daniel knew that he had a purpose, a calling on his life. He devoted himself to his faith, getting closer to God, and he never experienced an outburst like that again. But he knew that the demon was still out there, still watching him, still waiting for another chance to strike. However, folks, it didn't end there. There was another incident that would shake Daniel to his very core. This happened a few years later when Daniel was around 14. He was sound asleep in his bed, lost in the peaceful oblivion of slumber, when suddenly he was jolted awake by a presence in his room. Now, at first, he simply thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the moonlight streaming through his window. But as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized that it was something much more sinister. Hovering just inches from his face, there was a shape unlike anything he had ever seen. It was pitch black, darker than the deepest night, and it seemed to absorb all the light around it. And yet, despite its darkness, Daniel could feel it watching him. It could sense the malevolent intelligence behind its featureless facade. He did his best to scream and call out for help, for anyone to come and do something, but his voice was frozen. He was paralyzed with fear, unable to move a muscle, and the shape just drew closer and closer. And then, just when he thought it couldn't get any worse, he felt this wave of pure, unadulterated hatred emanating from this shape, directed solely at him. It was like nothing he had ever experienced, a hatred so intense that it made his skin crawl and his blood run cold. Yet, despite the overwhelming sense of evil, Daniel couldn't look away. He was transfixed by the shape, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. And just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving him alone in the dark, completely terrified. And his mind reeling, he tried to convince himself that it had just been a bad dream, a nightmare brought on by too much stress and too little sleep. But deep down, he knew the truth, that he had seen something that night, something that defied explanation, something that had targeted him specifically. The following day, he woke up feeling drained and exhausted, as if he had been running a marathon all night long. And yet, despite his fatigue, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the shape was still out there waiting for him. And so he went about his day as usual, trying to push the memory of the previous night to the back of his mind. But folks, everywhere he went, he could just feel eyes on him. He could sense a presence just beyond the edge of his perception. That night, it happened again. Daniel woke up to find the shape hovering over him once more, its hatred even more intense than before. But this time, Daniel was ready. He remembered the words of his foster mother and the power of the name of Jesus, and he began to pray, and he called out to God, begging for protection, for deliverance from the evil that had targeted him. And as he prayed, he felt this warmth spreading through his body and a sense of peace and strength that he had never known. The shape, he described, began to flicker and kind of dissolve and fade into the darkness, receding in the face of Daniel's faith. And with one final cry, Daniel called out the name of Jesus 7 times, just as his foster mother had taught him. In an instant, the shape vanished, banished back to the depths of hell from whence it came. And Daniel was left alone once more, his body shaking with relief and his heart filled with gratitude. Fast forward many years later, and Daniel is 30 years old. He's a grown man with a family and a successful career. But despite all the blessings in his life, he couldn't shake the feeling that something is still watching him, still waiting for the right moment to strike. And then, one night, it happens. Daniel is in his home office, working late on a project, when he hears a noise from downstairs. At first, he thinks it's just his imagination, a trick of mind brought on by too much caffeine and too little sleep. But he listened closely, and he realized it wasn't just a noise. It was a voice. A voice that he's heard before, that he thought he had banished all those years ago, but here it is, whispering to him from the shadows, calling out to him with a sickening sweetness that made his skin crawl. Now, Daniel tried to ignore it and just focus on his work, but the voice grew louder and more insistent with each passing moment, and then, just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, he feels a presence behind him, this cold breath on the back of his neck. So he spins around in his chair, his heart pounding in his chest, and there it is. The shape from his childhood, the malevolent entity that has haunted him for so long, but this time it's different. This time, it's not just a shapeless mass of darkness, a figure, a being with a face and a form, and what a face it is. It's a face Daniel had seen before, a face he thought he had left behind in the foster system all those years ago. It's the face of his abuser, the man who had tormented him and so many other children, the man who had been sent to prison for his crimes. But here he is, standing before Daniel with a twisted grin, his eyes glinting with malevolent light, and Daniel knows in that moment that this is no ordinary spirit. No mere specter of the past. This is something far worse, something that has been waiting for him all these years, biding its time until the moment was right. And the figure spoke to him, a voice so sickening and disgusting, Daniel tries to speak and call to God for help. But his voice is frozen in his throat. He's paralyzed with fear, just as he was all those years ago. And he knows that this time, there may be no escape. The figure moves forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on a string. As it draws closer, Daniel can see the rot and decay that cling to its flesh, the maggots that writhe in its eye sockets, and the worms that crawl from its mouth. "You thought you could escape me," the figure would hiss, its breath hot and fetid against his face. "You thought you could run away and forget everything I did to you. But I never forgot, Daniel. I never forgot the way you screamed, the way you begged for mercy. And now I will make you pay for ever thinking you could get away from me." And so the figure reached down with a gnarled hand, its fingers brushing against his cheek in this disgusting display of affection. And Daniel knows that at that moment, he was going to die. He's gonna die at the hands of this thing, this demon that has haunted him for so long. But then something miraculous happens. As this thing's hand closes around Daniel's throat, as its fingers begin to squeeze the life from his body, he feels a surge of strength rising up with him. It's the same strength that he felt all those years ago, the same power that had banished the demon from his body and sent it fleeing back to the depths of hell. And with a cry of defiance, Daniel called out the name of Jesus once more. He shouts it with all his strength and faith, his voice ringing out through the darkness like a clarion call. The figure recoils as if struck, its hand releasing its grip on Daniel's throat, and Daniel continues to pray, calling out to God for deliverance. The figure begins to flicker and fade, its form growing more and more insubstantial with each passing moment. And then, in an agonized scream, it vanishes, banished once more. And so Daniel is left all alone in his office, his body shaking with relief, and he's completely terrified, but his heart is filled with gratitude. He knows that he will never be truly free of the demons that have haunted him, that they will always be there, waiting in the shadows for a moment of weakness. But he also knows that he has the strength and the faith to face them, to banish them back to the darkness, whenever and wherever they rear their ugly heads. As far as the disgusting demonic entity that plagued Daniel for all those years, we have no idea what it could be. It remains unknown. And because you guys made it this far into the episode, I want you to all comment down below, "I believe," so that way I know who made it to the end of the episode and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we go in deep to things of the mysterious and supernatural, then go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button for more. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.